Good morning and welcome to 2 Samuel. And we read chapter 9 last week, and we're beginning with chapter 10 now. I do not have to begin, and I'm seeing some big names. I wonder if we'll put Leslie on the spot.
I'm fine. I can read it for you if you would like.
Oh my gosh, you're amazing.
I see.
Through the wilderness of these names.
That's okay.
It's a relatively short chapter. If you're okay, I would say
can
just
read
go.
Yeah, it's only 19 verses. I can read it.
But if you need a break halfway through, we understand. So
We'll see. Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sometime afterward, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hunan succeeded him. David said, I will deal loyally with Hunan, son of Nahash, just as his father dealt loyally with me. So David sent envoys to console him concerning his father. When David's envoys came into the land of the Ammonites, the princes of the Ammonites said to their lord Hanan, do you really think that David is honoring your father just because he has sent messengers with condolences to you? Has not David sent his envoys to you to search the city, to spy it out, and then to overthrow it? So Hanan seized David's envoys, shaved off half the beard of each, cut off their garments in the middle of their hips, and sent them away. When David was told, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. The king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. When the Ammonites saw that they had become odious to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Arameans of Beth-rehob and the Arameans of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, as well as the king of Makkah, 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. When David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the army with the warriors. The Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate. But the Arameans of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Tob and Makkah were by themselves in the open country. But Joab saw that the battle was set against him, both in front and in the rear. He chose some of the picked men of Israel and arrayed them against the Arameans. The rest of his men he put in charge of his brother Abishai, and he arrayed them against the Ammonites. He said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. Be strong, and let us be courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God. May the Lord do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people who were with him moved forward into battle against the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the Ammonites saw that the Arameans fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. But when the Arameans saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. Hadadezer sent and brought out the Arameans who were beyond the Euphrates, and they came to Helam, with Shobach and the commander of the army of Hadadezer at their head. When it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. The Arameans arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. The Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed of the Arameans sent 100 chariot teams, 700 chariot teams, and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobach, the commander of the army, so that he died there. When all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore.
Wow.
And just think that it started out as a a misunderstanding.
Yes, exactly. And it feels very much in that same way that, you know, nations led by sensitive men can get can easily escalate into war and balloons over countries and, you know, misinterpret not Civil War. Well, yeah, the Civil War, but also the Cuban Missile Crisis too. It was about as much about Khrushchev's ego as it was about anything else in some ways. What do y'all think? Y'all, sorry.
I think it was just last week that we talked about these numbers and how
Yeah.
they're probably just symbolic numbers and
Yeah.
not real numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those thousands and all that, it just
Well,
amazes
thousands
me.
from this little country that
Right.
no one has ever heard of
Yeah.
before.
Right.
Right.
You know,
Be lucky if they had 4,000 period.
I know, there's nobody left.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right, right. It's the same like the ages, you know, from
900 and some
Genesis,
years old.
hundreds and
yeah.
hundreds of years. It's just, they meant to say long time,
Yeah.
but they put it.
Well, and we don't know
It
how
doesn't
they
make
mark-
sense.
We don't know how they mark time either,
Right, exactly,
you know,
you know.
they
Very,
might have
very
got 10 years in one of our years.
Do we think this is another situation like what David was, well, he's off maybe, but he had said some of these seem like David's got these sort of hitmen who will go and do despicable things that benefit David and his
right.
kingdom, but David gets to kind of stay above it all
I think
and
that's
say,
right.
oh, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm so benevolent.
Yes.
But the
a bit
things
of a
that
good
are
cop, bad
helping
cop.
David are getting done anyway.
Right,
Right? We talked about this maybe
Yes.
2 weeks ago.
I think that's right.
Mhm.
Very, very political in that way too, that you just have kind of it's like the president is, you know, think about last night, president gets to smile and has that warmth of kind of, you know, and power and charge, but you know, behind the scenes are the chief of staff and the deputy chief of staff and all those people that go out and, you know, what do I want to say, you know, execute, not literally, but like make things happen. I think especially of President Obama's longtime chief of staff was Rahm Emanuel, who you all know quite well.
Mhm.
And a man who's, I think, what did they say in A Christmas Story? Some artist, he would say, my father dabbled in expletives like other artists dabbled in oils. I think that's kind of Rahm Emanuel too, you know, it's like Barack Obama could be the good guy and behind the scenes, Rahm Emanuel was a pit bull, right? Same here, same here.
Yes.
Happens always in history.
well, and it seemed like David's response to this envoy, these men having half of their beards cut off,
Right,
you know. It
And
might,
their-
it
and
might
their
have been
pants.
embarrassing or something. And my translation was a little different. It said that their garments were cut off halfway up the buttocks.
Mine-
Not midway through the hips.
Yes.
So,
yep, so
these guys-
embarrassing,
right,
Yeah.
Yes.
and you know, and I can understand where David might be upset. You know, he had good intentions. And those intentions were misinterpreted, but probably misinterpreted based upon his past actions against various other
Mhm.
nations of millions of people. But it just seems like that's a huge leap. Half a beard gone, and so we're gonna slay thousands of
Mhm.
people.
yeah,
Mhm.
And to think that God was actually behind all of that.
Right.
You just have to wonder about,
arguably.
right, you know.
It's more like the name of God was invoked, yeah, yeah, it's true, it's always a good, you know, it's just this human folly, and then you have to ask yourself, you know, this is people's experience of faith, it's not, you know, I've become more and more stalwart about this as I get older, it's just like,
Mhm.
God did not write this book, first of all, he would have painted himself in a much better light.
Right.
If he was able to write this book, no, this is people's experience of God, so they think clearly I've got God on my side, you know, and that's the same in some way mentality as the Crusades, you know,
Right.
many years later.
Exactly. But it really is, it's amazing how much of that still exists.
Oh,
on
still
some
exists.
level. You know, the one example that I can give that I'll never forget, when the mayor of New Orleans, his response to Hurricane Katrina was to say that this was God's punishment for the wickedness of the people of New Orleans.
Right,
You know, how Old Testament is that? You know,
exactly.
Right.
and to think that somebody in a public position would actually espouse that
Yes.
and be on
Yes.
nationwide TV, but it's
Well-
amazing how.
And how many states, I'm gonna just go there, but how many states or state capitals have monuments to the Ten Commandments and those kind of things, you know,
Mhm.
these kind of structures that they hold up, but they don't really understand quite what they're doing, and they especially don't understand the laws governing this country. And that blurring that line between church and state more, but it reminds me a little bit of, remember how this book, Second Samuel, began with David bringing the Ark of the
Mhm.
Covenant into the city and dancing.
Mhm.
And forget about that his wife at the time, Nicole, was humiliated watching him dance half naked, but the idea of I have the Ark, therefore I have God on my side, you know, it's kind of, I think there's a little bit of that too when you say, well, I'm a Christian, I'm the governor of Arkansas, don't know why I'm saying Arkansas. And I'll put up the Ten Commandments here, and therefore I'm right and you're wrong, and you know, and my religion's the correct one, and everyone else's doesn't count. It's just
I always,
like,
I always wonder why they want to insist on the Ten Commandments instead of the Sermon on the Mount, but you know,
Yeah,
so.
me too,
Yeah.
David.
exactly, exactly.
I know I'm like getting the scripture for this week as part of Sermon on the Mount, and it's about where if you murder someone, the Ten Commandments say that's bad, but if you hate someone and you're angry and you call them names, that's really bad too.
Yeah,
And I've been like trying to figure out how to package this for toddlers, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And if you put the Ten Commandments up, you're just ignoring everything Jesus said,
right.
because why don't you put up, you know, do unto others or love your neighbor,
Exactly.
or don't murder, but also don't have hate in your heart and call people names. Because I don't think a lot of people, maybe that would be useful in some of
Yeah.
our political buildings.
No,
That's
right.
what Jesus actually said.
Jesus is worried about what's going on in our hearts.
There's
Yeah.
a saying down here, and it's God don't like ugly.
I love that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, that, the Ten Commandments allow us to self-justify and allow us to do pretty much what we want to. It allows us to feel better than other people. It allows us to not challenge the kingdom of this world. And Jesus instituted a kingdom, new kingdom that's very difficult, a kingdom of service, kingdom of hate, of love, of love even those, even our enemies. And it's really different from what we're reading about here in Second Samuel. And it's much more difficult because in that way, you know, we don't have the right to slay people when they get on our nerves. So,
And, you
yeah,
know,
that,
and this is all, it is of a piece of the idea of just David being a, you know, a man who was really anointed, blessed by God, and is yet kind of, it's, you know, Jesus would quickly say here, if, you know, if all we had read, of all we had read, Jesus would say, yeah, but there's something not right with David's soul, you know, something not right with his, there's a kind of a fatal flaw here, you know, and that, and I say that too with some little foreshadowing because of what we're about to read as well. Yeah, sorry for
And-
those names, but it's complicated, isn't it?
yeah, I think it illustrates the evolutionary nature. Well, you know, I use that term advisedly, of people's relationship with God and their understanding of what God was truly like. And we talked a little bit about last week about the fact that David wasn't supposed to build a temple, and we don't really understand it until we get the, you know, other accounts where we read that the reason it was given, at least at that time, was that he wasn't to build a temple because he was a man of blood, that he had
Mhm.
slain people. And so there's an evolving understanding of what God is really like. And I think God is gracious to us, and he's gracious to people back then as well, to understand that they come from a world in which understanding the depths of his love and grace and compassion just didn't fit in with the worldview. And so he was patient with people at that time, and he brings us along. But now we have an example. We have Jesus, who is supposed to be the perfect representation of God, of his nature. And now we have that to look at. But unfortunately, a lot of us don't want to embrace that. We want to go back to the Old Testament God because it allows us to, well, like I say, self-justify the things we would really like to do.
True. Very true. Yeah, well, chapter 11, we're gonna be introduced to a major character in the Old Testament, and I'm gonna, while the next person reads, I'm gonna step out and grab my women's Bible, unless you have it, Barb.
I
Mm-hmm.
do.
Oh, you do?
Want it?
'Cause no, we'll wait till after we read it,
Oh.
but I'm sure there's a blurb in there about Bathsheba. This is another one, I had an idea. This is another one talking about teaching to children. I'm always curious how a children's Bible story is gonna cover this story,
They
if
don't.
at all. They just skip
They
it.
all skip it.
They
Yeah.
all
If at all.
have to just be left alone.
You know, like I said, it was,
Don't.
we were teeing this up, but this is a pretty important chapter here, and we'll split it up after verse 15. Would someone like to read 1 to 15 from their
You want me
book?
to do a message?
Oh, sure. Great.
Okay. And the title
Yeah,
on mine
maybe
is
I can give you a
David's
second.
Sin and Sorrow.
Okay.
When the time of year came around again, the anniversary of the Ammonite aggression, David dispatched Joab and his fighting men of Israel in full force to destroy the Ammonites for good. They laid siege on Rabbah, but David stayed in Jerusalem. One late afternoon, David got up from taking his nap and was strolling on the roof of the palace. From his vantage point on the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was stunningly beautiful. David sent to ask about her and was told, "Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite?"
Mhm.
Da-
Got it.
David sent his agents to get her. After she arrived, he went to bed with her. This occurred during the time of purification following her period. Then she returned home. Before long, she realized she was pregnant. Later, she sent word to David, "I'm pregnant." David then got in touch with Joab, "Send Uriah,
It's like Uriah, like
okay.
Mariah. Yeah, you
Okay.
got it.
Uriah the Hittite to me." Joab sent him. When he arrived, David asked him for news from the front, how things were going with Joab and the troops and with the fighting. Then he went to Uriah,
You got it.
"Go home, have a refreshing bath and a good night's rest." After Uriah left the palace, an informant of the king was sent after him, but Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance along with the king's servants. David was told that Uriah had not gone home. He asked Uriah, "Didn't you just come off a hard trip? So why didn't you go home?" Uriah replied to David, "The chest is out there with the fighting men of Israel and Judea in tents. My master Joab and his servants are roughing it out in the fields. So how can I go home and eat and drink and enjoy my wife? On your life, I'll not do it." "All right," said David, "have it your way. Stay for the day and I'll send you back tomorrow." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem the rest of the day. The next day, David invited him to eat and drink with them, and David got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah again went out and slept with the master's servants. He didn't go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In the letter, he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front lines where the fighting is the fiercest. Then pull back and leave him exposed so that he's sure to be killed."
Okay. Pause there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mhm.
So we got the daughter and he's trying to kill the dad.
Yeah.
Is that what?
Oh, no, kill the husband.
That was the husband.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, there's a
Oh,
little,
wait,
it gets
I thought it was
confusing. They are mentioning her as, like you always, you
Daughter.
kind of tend to do as their parent.
He was trying to send him home so he wouldn't get caught and could say the child was her husband's.
Right,
Right.
right.
That's the timing.
You're exactly right, Dawn. Yeah. So it turns into a bit of Days of Our Lives here. But then turns very dark when Uriah just isn't getting the message. probably because David's not telling him exactly what's going on. And just decides the only way I can get myself out of this mess is to just exterminate Uriah, which is a really devastating decision.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
dark.
Yeah.
This,
So-
this,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
this is an uncomfortable passage because I've heard it when I was growing up. Pretty much there was conservative Christians tend to blame Bathsheba for the whole thing, that she
Yeah.
somehow
I'm
tempted
shocked.
David. But
That's-
if you look deeply into the details of the story, that's not necessarily what's going on. In fact, a lot of people, more contemporary womanist scholars and feminist scholars, are pointing out the fact that essentially what happened was David raped her, because it's not like quite likely anyway. She may have been accepting, but when a king sends for you and sends his soldiers for you, you come, and then whatever happens, and you don't have any recourse. So this is David's it wasn't just that he killed Uriah, but more than that, he more than likely sexually assaulted Bathsheba to to achieve his purpose. And the fact is, there are questions: why was David there? Why was he there and the army was out in the field?
Right.
What was he
Just
doing?
the chapter before, he was out there fighting. Now
Yeah.
he's back
What's
like a king.
And what she was doing is not, she wasn't there. This they also make a point of it in the message. They block it off with parentheses that she was this was during her time of ritual purification. He wasn't, there were not supposed to be any sexual relations of any kind at that time. She was doing what she was required to by to make herself ceremonially pure. Yeah.
So
So
that's
anyway.
two things there. David, you're absolutely awesome, of course. And that's two reasons there. One is, obviously he took advantage of her, and I'm being coy, or raped, sexually assaulted. That's one. Then then there's the Jewish law of she's not quote unquote clean. We have to separate that for right now and just say that's the rules. And so they've broken that rule. And then don't forget, the other part of it, as difficult as it is, she is another man's property, and he has brought dishonor from that being, even though he's king. That is a big no-no. You just do not covet thy neighbor's possessions. That's kind of what that's hinting at in some ways. So it's like a triple threat here, and I'm presuming that it could mean, spell a devastating politics really for David, which is why he's trying to get rid of him so quickly. And it's just devolving into bad decision after bad decision.
I think it's kind of nice, like rhetorically, the way they structure it, where Uriah tells him, God is in the field and the men are in the field. How could I sleep in a comfortable bed
Right.
and have sex with my wife
Right.
when all this is going on? When David is sleeping in a comfortable bed.
Yeah,
And
with his wife.
Yeah, with.
it's a bit,
It's just
like the way it's structured is
Uriah is
beautiful.
practically an angel by
I
comparison.
mean,
Yeah.
it's just condemning like so many
Yeah.
bad things.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's awful. And yet it's
Bad
here,
decision.
it's not. I commend in some ways the editors and the shapers of this book, this scroll, for keeping this story in there when I'm sure there was ample debate about whether to take this out. This is such a problem is that there's children involved in this lineage. That problem in the sense that they have to tell this story because the child of David and Bathsheba is kind of an important part of the story as well. So they can't hide from this one. And it's just how far we've come from the little boy and Goliath, and how great and how much promise there was there, and yet how it could be squandered so quickly. And yet problematic for all the many reasons that we still have the city of David, the Star of David. David's the great king, warrior king of Israel to this day.
Right. And, not looking ahead so much, but just thinking what might happen, you would think that going against God's actual will to this point would probably mean devastation in the works for Israel. I mean, based upon how God responded previously to when Israel turned their back on his laws and refused to follow the tenets and all that.
Right.
You know, David is so blatantly doing ungodly things that you would think that that would spell disaster for Israel
Right.
at some point.
And it does. And it does. But the thing is, and as Greg's pointed out, alluded to, is that David's referred to as a man after God's own heart. And I don't think that's performance based, but that's based on the fact that the one thing David did do, which would make him quite different from most kings at that time and other people, was that he repented when he's actually confronted. And we'll get into that later, but he repented. He was willing to realize, yes, even though I'm the king, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I'll pay the price. And so that tells us something even about then, what God was trying to demonstrate about his gracious nature and his love, that even when we go so terribly astray, we aren't rejected by God. God still will extend his grace to us.
Beautifully said. Yeah. While we're still in this kind of this dark moment here, I didn't want to leave what David mentioned, which was certainly the Jewish tradition and definitely the Christian tradition has tended to, over time, over much of the last 2,000 years, read this as it's Bathsheba's fault for being so pretty. It's Bathsheba's fault for being seductive.
Yeah.
Right. And that you can see in plain Hebrew, plain English or variations of English. Does that say that anywhere in here? That's not in the text. So it's amazing how those who take the Bible literally sometimes will also try to read between the lines when it suits the need that they want. And by the way, the exact same thing happens with somebody else in scripture. Anyone come to mind of a person who's reviled as a sexual, whatever, torturous female, not torturous, Mary Magdalene. Yeah, exactly. And that's nowhere to be found in scripture. That's all Christian tradition. Just saying, she had demons, therefore we'll make her a prostitute, because we men can't handle when women are attractive, and we're the ones who can't handle our emotions or our impulses.
Going right back to the foundational story, Adam obviously was not able to withstand the temptation that Eve was, presenting him.
Yeah.
It's like he was putty in her hands or something.
Right.
Rather than saying, hey dear, didn't we hear God saying not to do this?
And that's obviously a homegrown parable of the Hebrews, but it's an understanding of this is what men are like. I mean, this is in our nature, and it's not good. There are consequences to these things, first and foremost, the taking of this woman.
One of the things I was going to say was that growing up in the last, 30, 40 years with me, is I always hear from women in my church especially about women who get pregnant out of wedlock, and they blame it on the woman. The woman needs to not let this happen. And I just think about it, and it's like two people are involved in this situation.
Right.
And it's, if they don't want their children to have sex before marriage, that's not going to happen. In our society, that's boys, when they turn whatever, they want to have sex. I understand that. But the thing is the woman also does. I mean,
right. Because when telling a child not to do something, or telling a teenager no, when did that ever result in that?
And they say abstinence is the only reason to but when you tell people abstinence and don't give them any type of birth control measures, then you're going to have a grandchild. I'm sorry, but that's a very possibility. And so I just every time I think about it, I think, people, I hear it all the time. even in small groups that I go to now, is, you know, that it's the girl's fault. The girl should not have dressed that way. The girl should not have done this. Girl should not have, it's, and I get angry because
It's awful, yeah.
the girl's fault, we're, I was, so many times I was told when I was in the army, I lived with a couple family for a short time. And there were times where I would walk out of the room and I might have dressed a little provocatively. I don't know. I never was, but I was told to go change, or I was told that, oh, you need to wear something across the front of your dress, something like that, just to protect you. And it makes you a little frustrated because I didn't grow up that way. I grew up in a much more lenient family and everything. But anyway, so but I just get angry. It frustrates me because I hate it when the women are always made
A double standard,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Well, it's all a function to subordinate women. It's just, it's part, and they go back to these, the Garden of Eden passages. They go back to, blaming Bathsheba, blaming Mary Magdalene. It's all an attempt to keep women subordinate to men. And, to say that they are inherently somehow less than, or not able to, they don't have the ability to discern, or it's just, and it's still used today in certain portions of the church, where women are portrayed as inherently less able to be involved in spiritual leadership, or even lead themselves spiritually, because they're inherently defective.
Right. Exactly. Barb has the
Oh, you want me to read
CEB
what it
Women's
says?
Bible, and this is a book entirely produced by female scholars. Again, we've read from it before, but I'd love to hear what they say about Bathsheba.
Bathsheba is often vilified as a woman who seduced King David, but if we read 2 Samuel 11 with eyes wide open, we see her as a victim of David's uncontrolled passion. He took her even after learning she was married. After he used her for his selfish purposes, he sent her away. The details of Bathsheba's story grip our hearts. When she discovered she was pregnant, there was no question of who had fathered the child she bore. She sent word the way we might send a text. I'm pregnant. We were not told whether David even replied to her. Expecting a child and alone, she became a deeply grieving widow under circumstances so suspicious they would have made a compelling television crime drama. After the traditional mourning period, the king took her into the palace. Soon after the baby was born, the unnamed son grew desperately ill and died. How her heart must have ached, one agony after another. Out of their grief for the child they lost, David and Bathsheba conceived again, and she bore another son, Solomon. She recognized Solomon as the fulfillment of a promise God and her husband made. She protected that promise. When Adonijah, Haggith's son, inserted himself as successor to King David, the position promised to Solomon, Bathsheba drew courage from God's prophet Nathan and approached David, reminding the aging king, you promised, you promised. Courageously, she called the promise breaker to be faithful to his word, and he was. Solomon became king by David's decree. Eventually, Bathsheba sat in the throne at his right hand. I see Bathsheba as a woman God empowered to stand firm and say, no more broken promises. How often is that the very stance we need at work with a boyfriend or spouse, extended family, or our children?
Ooh, beautiful.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
they give you a little preview of what's to come, but it's, think way back to Genesis, when Abraham has an affair with Tamar, I think, and has a child, Ishmael, out of wedlock. And then they're basically scuttled off the
Yes.
scene, send them out into the desert, and all that. Now we have Bathsheba, and she's not gonna go away quietly. Good, thanks be to God, right? And she's gonna end up giving birth to the child that will become the next king, and with God's help, it sounds like, again, where's God in all of this? Not with David, in everything we just read, there is no mention of God, because God is like, I do not condone what's going on here. But where God will come in, as God always does, is in the cleanup and in the kind of piecing things back together again, and giving the child Solomon a chance, by holding people's feet to the fire a little bit. Yeah, promises.
Cause that could have turned out much differently.
Oh, yeah,
I mean,
Mhm.
he was a bastard.
he could have
You
just
know, that-
executed
that's
her,
what
right? Yeah,
culture would have said.
sure,
Mhm.
And, he could have been exiled, Bathsheba could have been exiled, or worse,
Sure.
killed,
yes,
killed
exactly.
while she was with child.
Mhm.
Any number of things could have happened.
The story you point out about Tamar, Greg, is particularly poignant because the way it's portrayed in the Old Testament is that she was a servant of Sarah,
Sarah.
and there was a a, tr- uh, a tradition or a way of helping a childless couple where the servant could bear the child. Well, this is sex slavery, is what it is, and it was forcing Tamar into sex slavery. And then as soon as Sarah had the other baby, then she was just rejected, although God protected her. So this whole concept of the way women are treated in the Bible, even when you go back to the highlights of the Jewish patriarchy, they don't shine too well when you look at them very carefully in their treatment of women. It's really a telling story, the way the whole account goes throughout the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. The patriarchy is just obvious. It's just painfully obvious.
Though it's a slightly negative way to argue it, it is a fair argument for those maybe who are, basically queer, to
Mhm.
say to those who have been in power, the patriarchy, heterosexual, especially when they point to scripture as their authority on things, going, pretty sure scripture is saying here that straight people don't have it all figured out as well, these are your values of great relationships. I don't know about that. God's a bit bigger than that. So, okay, on that note, continuing, we'll finish up this chapter. Greg, did you want to read through?
Sure.
What you're saying?
Yeah,
So it's verse 16 to the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
So while Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew the defenders were strong. When the men of the city made a sortie against Joab, some officers of David's army fell, and among them Uriah the Hittite died. Then Joab sent David a report of all the details of the battle, instructing the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king all the details of the battle, the king may become angry and say to you, 'Why did you go near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall above? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Was it not a woman who threw a millstone down on him from the wall above so that he died in Thebes? Why did you go near the wall? Then you Then you in turn shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead.' The messenger set out, and on his arrival he relayed to David all the details as Joab had instructed him. He told David, 'The men had us at a disadvantage and came out into the open against us, but we pushed them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall above, and some of the king's servants died, among them your servant Uriah.' David said to the messenger, 'This is what you shall convey to Joab. Do not be chagrined at this, for the sword devours now here and now there. Strengthen your attack on the city and destroy it. Encourage him.' When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband had died, she mourned her lord. But once the mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her into his house. She became his wife and bore him a son. But the Lord was displeased with what David had done.
There we go. So if you're, again, you're wondering where God is in all this, because in all these previous chapters, not all of them, but mostly First Samuel, when David was in trouble, he prayed to God, or when he needed help. Here he's in trouble. He does not pray to God. He does the worst possible thing, really orders, in many ways, orders the execution of the woman's husband. And you get this back and forth here with the messengers to basically say that, you know, Joab's worried David's going to be upset because he let all these people get killed. And David's saying that's expendable because I wanted Uriah killed.
Yeah.
Which is just, you know, it's just worst decision upon worst decision, just digging him a deeper hole to get to that climax there, that final sentence. What David had done was evil in the Lord's eyes. But as David said, our David, not this David, our David said, there's a path through even when someone has gone astray in such a terrible way like this. There is a path through for repentance.
For the sake of background, how did Uriah the Hittite,
Become his name.
well, no, how the Hittite, an officer of Israel? I mean, had he been conquered? Was he a mercenary?
Those are
How
good
did he gain
It's a
that
great
position?
question.
I
And
was so wrapped up in all the scandal. I didn't even.
I forgot about the tribe. Well, yeah. He must have conquered the Hittites, absorbed them into the armies and all, yeah.
something like that, I would imagine.
But it's, maybe that's wrapped up in it, is that him being a Hittite is, I'm getting, my brain is confused at the moment because I'm thinking about Ghostbusters, the movie where they just for the heck of it. No, because there's a scene where they talk about Hittites and I'm trying to remember what that is all about.
I have a
Sorry.
footnote that might help a little bit. It says, just talking about the names of her dad and her husband. So this
Oh.
Eliam, Bathsheba's father, sometimes identified with Eliam, son of Ahithophel, a member of David's elite corps of the 30. Uriah the Hittite was also a member of the 30. Although his name, Uriah in Hebrew, means Yahweh is my light, shows that he was probably a native-born Israelite. But his title suggests that he was originally descended from the Hittites. They were an Anatolian people of the 2nd millennium BC, whose descendants populated a number of Syrian cities in the time of David.
Got it.
So it wouldn't have been so much that he was from a different country as that sort of like if someone here is Polish, but they grew up here for years.
I see. Well, I was wondering then,
great.
if
That's how I read
the
it.
Yeah.
fact that he was called Uriah the Hittite, if somehow that softened the blow for some
Yeah.
people.
I mean, you might
I mean,
be
after all,
right.
he was just a Hittite, or,
Yeah.
you know, why was, you know, he was a highly respected, trusted officer. And why was Joab so ready to
like
say, okay, sure, let's kill
Uriah-
him, you know,
Uriah the
I'll help
Packers
you do
fan.
this horrible
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
But maybe, you know, I just wondered if that was a little bit of backhand othering or something.
Maybe.
I think
you know.
so, yes.
But we talked about how all these people that disappear that bother David,
Mhm.
even though he seems kind of keeps his hands clean. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about like the Russian oligarchs was what I thought about.
Yeah.
And so maybe Joab's like, sure, we can get rid of a Hittite. Like I don't want to be me getting knocked off the
Right.
balcony of a hotel.
Right.
So I don't know. But David, I think you're gonna say something. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say the Hittites were never real enemies of Judah. They were a much larger kingdom than the Hebrew kingdom of Judah and Israel. They were more like the divided, could be in comparison to the divided kingdom of Egypt. But anyway, they were not traditional enemies. So this person could have just, there was not the the enmity, there that would be towards other people in the area. So
Wonderful. Other thoughts about this chapter? The whole thing?
I just have to say, I'm so glad I have the Woman's Bible because it's so reassuring that there are wonderful women in the Bible that we wouldn't necessarily even hear about.
Yeah, let
Well,
alone
we
reclaim
may
them.
hear about in terms of just a short, but I'm just so glad. I think it was you who probably told me about
Yeah,
this
yeah,
woman's
yeah.
Bible, so thank you for that, because it.
That's because I had professors involved in it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat. It's great when you hear voices of the marginalized, especially marginalized from the Bible,
Mhm.
but women, people of color, sexuality, different sexuality, you know, these are all criticisms that are only, in the grand scheme of things, pretty young within the last 50 years. And only in the last couple of years do we start to get things like their own translations, their own editors, that you can have a book, a translation, and all the footnotes and everything are all done by women scholars is pretty significant. Yeah. And that they're, you know, it's like my two professors for Old Testament and New Testament were both women as well. And that they're the ones who were saying, I love scripture and I want to defend it and, you know, support it. And say too that there are some really problematic things, but there are also some really beautiful things as well, you know, and that it's just because this is also a message I'm always saying to the LGBT community, which is there are some harmful things out of context to LGBT people, but that doesn't mean throw out the whole Bible. There's so much more in there that is useful and helpful, and spiritually healing. And the same goes for women, as you can see here with Bathsheba. You know, this she is not deduced to just being a seductress or something. You know, that's not it at all. And it's, you just uncover so much more. It's wonderful.
I think sometimes we need to just remember that not everything that happens in the Bible is necessarily an endorsement either. And
Right.
that,
Yeah.
just because it's stated without, and sometimes without even any kind of editorializing, sometimes the Hebrew people are, and the things that the heroes of the Bible do are used as good examples, and sometimes they're used as bad examples.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I would just mention to anyone who's interested, there are branches of theology that are becoming prominent or well known now that are really helpful in these regards. And we talked about feminist theologians like your professors. You talk about womanist theologians, which are specifically African American women theologians that not only look at things from the perspective of a woman, but as a woman of color, a woman of a minority position, and what they have added to our understanding of the Old Testament. And some of these passages are really, really, really important.
Couldn't have said it any better myself. Absolutely. Next week, when we pick it back up, I can't help myself. I'm like I'm hosting a TV show, you know. Next week, our special guests are, we're going to be introduced to a new character named Nathan. Because if you're wondering here, how is David going to get out of this? Well, what's the key figure that David's missing that his predecessor had? He had a prophet, Samuel. Remember the book's called Samuel? So David needs a prophet. So this is how God's going to start to fix this situation, in case you want to read ahead a little bit. God's going to send David a prophet. And it's like putting David in rehab a little bit, spiritual rehab. And we'll go from there. All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care, all.
Bye.
Here, Dawn.